Welcome. So what we do here is take these huge, complex subjects, turn them inside out, and really synthesize all that information into something clear and compelling.
And today we are tackling an absolute giant of a topic.
We really are. We're getting into one of the most significant cultural figures of the last century, Superman. This is all about understanding the foundation of a modern myth.
Our whole focus here is to synthesize the actual source materials. We want to uncover the specific historical facts, the developmental turns that really truly underpin this character. We're moving way beyond just summarizing comic book plots.
Right.
We're going to trace the very surprising genesis of the Man of Steel. We'll analyze the profound and often devastating legal battles that followed his creation.
And really try to clarify what explains his remarkable, almost 90-year relevance.
Exactly.
When you talk about establishing a genre, this is the blueprint. Superman, first appearing in Action Comics #1 on April 18, 1938. He wasn't just another popular character, he literally defined the superhero archetype.
He gave us all the conventions, didn't he?
Yeah, all of them. The outlandish costume, the secret code name, these extraordinary abilities hidden under a totally mundane disguise. And the numbers, they just speak for themselves. This is still the best-selling comic book series globally.
Over 600 million copies sold worldwide.
It's an unprecedented cultural footprint. It's massive.
It is. And the mission for you, as you listen, is to understand that the iconic figure who finally showed up in 1938, he was the end result of a long, really complex, and constantly shifting creative process.
It wasn't a single flash of inspiration.
Not at all. We have to start long before that first publication date back in the early 1930s to really grasp the volatile, changing forms he took before publication, and then the emotional and legal wars that his creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, were forced to fight.
Okay, so let's unpack this creation story. It really has to start with the two men themselves, because their partnership in high school is just as crucial as the character they invented.
It all begins in Cleveland, Ohio, back in 1932. This is where the writer, Jerry Siegel, and the artist, Joe Shuster, form their creative bond. They're still in high school.
And they were brought together by a shared passion.
A very intense, shared admiration for science fiction. Siegel, he was the writer, and he was already active in that early sci-fi fan community. He was publishing these amateur stories in mimeographed fan magazines.
Right, fanzines.
Yes, and he titled his science fiction, The Advance Guard of Future Civilization. Shuster was his go-to illustrator. And you have to remember, they were ambitious, working right through the Great Depression, dreaming of turning this shared love of pulp adventure into a real career.
But the very first concept they came up with, the first one that used the name Superman, it's something that would probably shock most people today.
Oh, completely.
I know.
It's almost unrecognizable compared to the hero we all know.
What was it?
We call it Prototype 1. In 1933, Siegel writes a short story. It's called The Reign of the Superman. Now, crucially, the main character, a man named Bill Dunn, he was not a hero. He was an out-and-out villain.
A villain.
A villain. He was a homeless man, and he gets exploited by this evil scientist who tricks him into consuming a special drug. And the powers it gave him, they weren't physical at all. They were entirely psychic.
So, no super strength. What kind of powers?
Mind reading, mind control, and clairvoyance.
So an intelligent, malevolent figure controlling people's thoughts. That's a world away from a physical champion fighting for justice. And Schuster even drew him as bald. Right?
Exactly, a bald psychic mastermind. This early Superman used his power purely for malicious reasons, for profit and just for his own amusement. It really reflects some of the darker, more cynical tones you'd find in Depression-era pulp stories. He was just pure psychic villainy.
So why did they abandon a concept that was so radically different? It sounds like a total creative U-turn. Was it forced on them?
It was absolutely forced by commercial reality. Siegel and Shuster were desperate to succeed, and their main target was the syndicated newspaper strip market. That was the big prize.
And the feedback they were getting was blunt.
Very blunt. The editors kept telling them their psychic stories just weren't sensational enough. At that time, the public's appetite, especially coming out of the Depression, was shifting. People wanted clear-cut, dynamic, physical heroes.
So you could argue that the economic pressure of the 1930s literally demanded the invention of the action-based superhero.
I think it's a very accurate synthesis of the sources. Siegel realized that heroic protagonists, characters involved in raw physical spectacle, were just more commercially viable than these cerebral villains.
So he adapted.
He did. He modified the powers completely. The character shed the mind control, and instead he got superhuman strength and bulletproof skin. This second prototype was now a crime-fighting hero. The costume was still evolving, but Siegel later recalled that in some of the panels from this period, you could start to see a bat-like cape appearing.
So the visual language of action was starting to come together.
It was starting to coalesce, yes,
Right.
around dynamic silhouettes and a sense of power.
That shift, driven by commercial necessity, is one of the most important moments in fiction history. But even with this radical change, they still faced rejection after rejection.
A really painful, demoralizing cycle. Their revised 1933 comic book pitch, now called the Superman, they submitted it to Consolidated Book Publishers, which was also known as Humor Publishing.
And it was rejected.
Immediately.
Yeah.
And the disappointment was so intense that Joe Shuster, famously, he reacted by burning the drafted pages. He just set them on fire in frustration, saving only the cover.
Wow. It's sobering to think how close the whole idea came to just being destroyed by despair right there.
It really is. They kept trying. They even split up for a little while, and Siegel started looking for other, more established artists to work with.
And he briefly teamed up with Russell Keaton. That led to this very bizarre non-Kryptonian origin story. What was the Keaton version all about?
The Keaton script was a totally different sci-fi concept. The origin involved an exploding future Earth.
So not another planet.
No. The boy was sent backward in time to the year 1935, not across space. And he was found by a couple named Sam and Molly Kent. It was actually in this script that we first see a mention of Clark putting on a special uniform when he becomes Superman. So the need for that distinctive persona was recognized, but the iconic look still wasn't there.
And that strip was also rejected.
It was. Keaton abandoned the project, and Siegel and Shuster wisely reconciled.
Thank goodness they did, because it was in that final collaboration that they really introduced the essential elements. The alien origin and that dual identity that made him so unforgettable.
Sometime between 1934 and 1935, they got back together. And this is when they finally introduced the alien origin from the planet Krypton, and they named the baby Kal-El.
And Shuster finalized the look.
He did. He finalized that enduring aesthetic. The tights, the cape, the iconic shorts on the outside, and the S emblem. And he drew inspiration from a few very distinct sources to put together this look that had never really been seen before.
Like circus strongmen, right. That explains the musculature and maybe the pose.
Yes, exactly. Shuster was a big fan of fitness culture and strongmen, like Sigmund Breitbart. Some of the early concept art even had laced sandals, which were a staple of strongmen and classical heroes.
But those became boots later on.
They were later rendered as red boots, yes. The other big influence was the swashbuckling costumes and the dramatic poses of the actor Douglas Fairbanks. He starred in films like The Mark of Zorro, and that really influenced Superman's heroic stance and that sense of theatrical bravado.
So that's the visual identity. But the true masterstroke, the thing that guaranteed he would last, was the creation of Clark Kent as the total antithesis of the hero.
The dual identity mechanism is just pure genius. Clark Kent, the timid, bespectacled reporter. He was constructed specifically for dramatic contrast, and for all the humorous and emotional possibilities that came from that disguise.
And Siegel drew inspiration from some specific places for that harmless facade.
He did. He looked to silent film comedy, particularly Harold Lloyd, the mild-mannered man who gets pushed around before finally snapping into action, and also the secret identities used in a lot of classic pulp films.
And the famous love triangle with Lois Lane, that speaks to a very personal kind of wish fulfillment, doesn't it?
Oh, it connects directly back to Jerry Siegel's own adolescence. He admitted it himself. It came from his own awkwardness with girls in high school. He imagined this fantasy. What if he was secretly terrific, powerful, strong enough to jump over buildings?
Then the girls who overlooked him would finally notice.
Exactly. They would notice and worship the heroic version of him. Lois Lane, who is drawn to the power of Superman but is completely dismissive of the timidity of Clark Kent, she became the perfect vehicle for that adolescent, almost universal fantasy. And that simple, potent contrast is one of the keys to the character's enduring appeal.
So they finally have the finished character, the hero, the costume, the dual identity. But they still couldn't sell him to a syndicate. And that difficult path leads us right to the moment of publication and, tragically, the moment they sign their future away.
The final steps to publication in 1938 are just steeped in misfortune. After the McClure Syndicate rejected the strip, one of their associates, a man named Max Gaines, saw its potential. He recommended the material to Jack Leibowitz, who was putting together content for a new anthology magazine,
Action Comics.
Action Comics. And Siegel and Schuster, by this point, they were just worn down by years and years of rejection. They just wanted to see their creation in print, so they agreed to the offer.
And the compensation for launching what would become a multi-billion-dollar industry.
They submitted 13 pages of material, which they adapted from their old rejected newspaper strips, and they were paid a flat sum of $130.
$130.
But the overwhelming tragedy here is that the payment was only for the story itself. In early March of 1938, at Leibowitz's instruction, they signed a contract. And in that contract, they gave away the copyright for the character Superman to Detective Comics, Inc., the company that would become DC Comics free of any additional charge.
And while that might have been common practice for contract work at the time, this was their masterwork. This single act resulted in decades of regret and legal challenges.
It did. They had signed away rights to earlier works, sure, but Superman became a cultural phenomenon on a scale that nobody could have possibly anticipated. This decision, born of pure desperation and the exploitative industry practices of the day, it just resulted in decades of regret, emotional hardship, and these devastating legal challenges for them.
They unwittingly sold their future for $130.
That's the long and short of it.
But let's focus on the debut itself, because it was incredible. What were the core narrative elements that were established right there in Action Comics #1?
The essential origin story was all there, cemented. Kal-El, sent by his parents Jor-El and Lara just before Krypton's destruction. He's found by an American farming couple, Jonathan and Martha Kent, and the story immediately establishes his purpose, to use his fantastic, unique gifts for the benefit of all humanity, driven by the strong moral compass his adoptive parents gave him.
It grounded this alien story in very human values.
Deeply human values, yeah.
And it's so important to clarify the powers as they were originally presented, because the most iconic ability of all flight, it wasn't there yet.
Exactly. In Action Comics #1, Superman absolutely could not fly. His prodigious abilities, his superhuman strength, speed, durability, they're explained by two complementary factors. One, Kryptonians were a species millions of years advanced of our own.
And the second part was about gravity.
Critically, yes. They evolved on a planet with much higher gravity than Earth. So on Earth, with its lower gravity, he could run incredibly fast and, of course, leap tall buildings in a single bound.
Yeah.
But he did not achieve sustained flight.
That's such a key difference from how we see him now. What about the setting and the initial supporting cast?
Clark Kent starts his career as a journalist for a newspaper called The Daily Star. Lois Lane is there from the very beginning as his fiercely independent colleague.
But not the Daily Planet.
Interestingly, no. It was actually the subsequent 1940 radio serial, The Adventures of Superman, that changed the paper's name to the more dramatic The Daily Planet. And that show also introduced his boss, the editor Perry White. Jimmy Olsen, the photographer, he came along a little bit later to provide a relatable, younger male perspective for the readers.
Okay, moving on. The character's true longevity is based on that clever duality of Superman and Clark Kent. Let's really get into the deliberate construction of that timid persona.
The Clark Kent persona is one of the most effective disguises in all of fiction. It wasn't just a physical change, it was a complete behavioral performance. It was designed to deflect any suspicion and to safeguard his private life.
So how did he do it?
Clark adopted this passive, introverted personality. He would walk with a slight slouch, he spoke in a slightly higher, more nervous pitch, and he used these conservative, bland mannerisms. He basically weaponized being uninteresting.
And his choice of clothing was a deliberate camouflage as well.
Oh, absolutely. The bland, often ill-fitting business suit and those black-rimmed glasses, they were all designed to maximize the contrast with the powerful, colorful figure that was underneath.
And the job as a journalist, that served a purpose, too.
It served a dual strategic function. It gave him a, quote, plausible reason to be present at crime scenes, and it also acted as an extension of his heroic duty. He was bringing truth to the forefront and fighting for the little guy through the power of the press.
That attention to detail even went as far as his name.
It did. The middle names that were assigned to Clark in various continuities over the years, Joseph, Jerome, or Jonathan, they're subtle, sometimes overlapping acknowledgments of his creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and his adoptive father, Jonathan Kent. It's a nice little connection between the fiction and the real people who fought so hard for him.
Now, let's trace the incredible evolution of his powers over time. He goes from prodigious leaping to, well, almost godlike capabilities.
The first major step happened almost right away. In 1940, Debuting in the radio serial, the ability to fly was introduced. It specifically replaced the original running and leaping.
And that was a practical decision, wasn't it?
It was a practical necessity for the animators of the Fleischer cartoons and for the radio producers. Endless sequences of a character high jumping were visually awkward and technically difficult to convey. Flight immediately elevated the character's sense of spectacle and freedom.
What about his famous eye powers? When did they come in?
X-ray vision, his ability to see through objects, except for lead, was introduced relatively early. That was in Action Comics number 11 in 1939. Heat vision came a decade later in 1949.
And the explanation for that was interesting.
Initially, it was explained as simply him applying his X-ray vision at its highest possible intensity. We also saw the superhuman breath ability debut in 1940, which eventually evolved into the famous ability to freeze targets with a frigid blast by 1959.
But the most crucial revision, the one that really cemented the mythology as we understand it today, that involves the source of his strength.
Yes. The source shifted definitively in the 1960s. The initial explanation that Kryptonians were just genetically advanced was completely abandoned. Instead, all of Superman's powers, including his strength and durability, became attributed entirely to Earth's yellow sun.
He became a solar battery.
A biological solar battery, constantly absorbing radiation. And that power is deactivated by red sunlight, which is similar to the sun that bathes Krypton. This shift provided a clear, quasi-scientific explanation for his godlike abilities, and importantly, it gave creators a built-in mechanism for weakening him via stellar radiation.
Of course, a character that powerful needs equally powerful challenges. How did the creators deal with the problem of a basically invulnerable hero?
They introduced what we call critical weaknesses, and the most famous of all, kryptonite, it actually originated outside the comics. Is debuted in the 1943 radio serial.
Green kryptonite.
Green kryptonite, radioactive remnants of krypton that arrived on Earth. And they specifically nullify his powers and cause severe pain, nausea, and eventual death with prolonged exposure.
And that radio serial origin, that's the famous story about the voice actor needing a break.
That's the famous anecdote, yes.
Yeah.
The writers needed a reason for Superman to be incapacitated and weak, basically lying in bed so the voice actor, Bud Collyer, could take a vacation.
And once it was introduced, it just took off.
Under editor Mort Weisinger, the concept proliferated wildly. We saw all kinds of different forms: red, blue, black, and notably gold kryptonite, which permanently nullifies all of his powers. That offered a high-stakes, irreversible threat.
Beyond kryptonite, what are the other two fundamental, consistent vulnerabilities that can challenge Kryptonian?
First, there's magic. Since all his powers are biologically and astrophysically derived, magic is a dimension he simply can't resist. Enchanted weapons and spells affect him just as easily as they would a normal human. That vulnerability was established in 1964.
So a powerful sorcerer is a huge threat.
An existential threat that he cannot just punch his way through.
And the second weakness links back, ironically, to his very first origins as a psychic villain.
Exactly. Kryptonians are shown to be highly susceptible to powerful psychokinetic phenomena. While his physical strength doesn't matter, a powerful telepath or an illusion caster can wreak havoc on him internally.
How so?
A sufficient psionic assault can disrupt his perception of reality. It can induce strokes or even internally mangle his organs. It suggests that the highly evolved Kryptonian physiology has an inherent flaw against pure mental power. So the original concept of the psychic Superman essentially became the foundation for his deepest internal weakness.
That is precisely the synthesis, yes. His greatest internal threat is the power of the mind, the very thing he started out as.
To deal with all this complexity, the pressure of his life, and the need to protect all these sensitive alien artifacts, he needed a true sanctuary.
Which is where the Fortress of Solitude comes in. It made its debut in 1958. It's located in the remote Arctic, and it functions as a place of solace, a laboratory for his scientific experiments, and a secure vault for Kryptonian mementos and advanced technology.
And the early depictions were very specific.
Very. It was a cave sealed by a gigantic physical key that only Superman's strength could lift to open the door. Later versions, most famously in the 1978 film, evolved it into this elegant structure made of white crystal, which really reinforced its alien sublime nature. As the mythology grew, the editors had to step in to impose some control and really define what Superman was and wasn't allowed to be. Let's look at how those editorial constraints shaped the character.
Initially, Superman was rougher. He was almost a social activist, and he often used excessive force. In his first appearances, he was actively fighting the system.
He wasn't just stopping bank robbers.
No, not at all. He was known for demolishing tenements to force landlords and the government to build better housing. He would often draw fire from the National Guard. He fought crooked businessmen and politicians. It really reflected the liberal idealism of the Great Depression's New Deal. He was a populist vigilante.
But the publisher, fearing censorship, pretty quickly stepped in to soften that vigilante edge.
Yes, the Comics Code Authority was looming on the horizon. In 1940, under an editor named Whitney Ellsworth, Superman was dramatically softened. Ellsworth instituted a strict code of conduct that fundamentally banned Superman from ever killing.
And the villains changed too.
They did. To avoid scaring children and attracting the censors, the antagonists shifted dramatically from realistic gangsters and politicians to these colorful, outlandish villains like Ultrahumanite, Toyman, and the Prankster. The stories became lighter and much more safely fantastical.
The character then stabilized quite a bit under Mort Weisinger, who oversaw decades of the Silver Age. What defines the Weisinger era in terms of mythological discipline?
Mort Weisinger was the editor from 1941 all the way to 1970. And he imposed a very strict discipline and coherence on the mythology. He demanded that it be functional. He would meticulously assign story ideas, and he carefully planned the logic of Superman's powers, his origin, and his relationships.
This is the era that gave us a lot of the classic elements.
It did. This era introduced fan-favorite elements we still recognize today.
Right.
His cousin Supergirl, the bizarre clone Bizarro, his superdog Krypto, the Phantom Zone, and all the extensive rules for the various forms of kryptonite.
What's fascinating here, according to the analysis, is that this strict, complex system was both immensely appealing and, at the same time, somewhat alienating to different parts of the audience.
Precisely. This level of complexity made the stories beguiling to devoted readers who just loves keeping track of every little detail, every retcon, every rule. The universe became this welcoming, ordered haven for them.
But for newcomers,
it was simultaneously alienating to casuals who felt like they needed an encyclopedia just to follow the action. And Weisinger maintained this complexity while deliberately avoiding sensitive, real-world subjects like the Vietnam War. He kept the world as pure fantasy.
That need to appeal to a changing audience forced some necessary modernization, though, starting with Julius Schwartz in the 1970s.
When Julius Schwartz took over in 1970, he recognized that he was losing newer readers. He attempted to streamline and modernize the character. He tried making Clark Kent a television anchor, a more modern medium.
Right.
And he retired some of the overused elements, like the endless robot doppelgangers and all the excessive kryptonite variants. Schwartz also scaled Superman's powers back, closer to Siegel's original depiction, trying to make him feel a bit more grounded.
Though TV anchor change was later reversed.
It was, yes.
But the biggest, most lasting shift came in 1986, following DC's company-wide reboot, Crisis on Infinite Earths.
This led to John Byrne's The Man of Steel reboot, which significantly reduced his powers again. It seems to be a continual struggle with Superman's excessive power level. Byrne also radically reimagined key supporting characters. Lex Luthor, who had always been a mad scientist, became this powerful, ruthless, billionaire industrialist.
Which made him a foe who fought Superman through corporate and political means, not just with ray guns.
Exactly. And crucially, Byrne made sure that Superman was the absolute sole surviving Kryptonian.
And that meant Supergirl had to be fundamentally changed to maintain that focus on him.
Yes. To preserve his unique status and his burden, Supergirl had to be reimagined. She became an artificial, shape-shifting organism, not Kal-El's biological cousin, at least for a while. This just shows the creative extremes they had to go to in order to keep that core concept, the alien orphan, clean and powerful.
And no discussion of Superman's modern history is complete without mentioning the media frenzy that surrounded his death.
The death of Superman's storyline in 1992 was unprecedented. Superman number 75 sold over 23 million copies. It became the best-selling single issue of a comic book of all time.
It proved that even if the core readership numbers were lower by the 1990s, the character still commanded massive global attention.
It did. And although he was later revived by Kryptonian technology, the narrative really showed the constant struggle that creators faced in trying to introduce genuine, high-stakes conflict to an invincible icon.
We now have to turn to the most tragic part of the Superman story, which is the relentless series of copyright battles fought by his creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. This is where the human price of that creation becomes incredibly steep.
The history is truly unfortunate. As we mentioned, they signed away the copyright to Superman for free in 1938. Now, they were paid well in the early years. They received over $400,000 between 1938 and 1947, which was a substantial amount for the time.
But that financial security quickly evaporated when you measure it against the character's eventual multi-billion-dollar value.
The immense regret and anger set in almost immediately as soon as the character exploded in popularity and DC started expanding the mythology without their consultation or any additional payment.
And the conflict really ignited when DC published Superboy while Siegel was serving in the U.S. Army.
That's correct. DC published the child version of the hero, Superboy, based on an old script Siegel had submitted years earlier, but they did it without purchasing the character rights. Upon his discharge, Siegel was justifiably furious. In 1947, he and Schuster sued DC Comics for the rights to both Superman and Superboy.
And it's just essential here to acknowledge the profound struggle of these creators. They were watching their life's work generate unimaginable wealth for others while they fought just for recognition and a fair share.
The initial ruling was a peculiar split decision. The judge determined that Superman belonged to DC Comics, but Superboy was deemed a separate entity that belonged to Siegel.
So that led to a settlement.
It led to an out-of-court settlement in 1948. DC paid the pair $94,013.16 for the full rights to both characters. And then, in a crushing move that just underscores the immense disparity of power, DC immediately fired both of them.
Fired. After having just bought the complete rights to their most important creations, so now they had no job and no ownership over their defining work.
They tried again years later. They attempted to leverage a key provision in the older copyright law, the renewal option in the Copyright Act of 1909.
What was that?
Under that law, copyright was granted for 28 years with an option for the creator to renew it for a second 28-year term. In 1965, the year that first term expired, Siegel and Schuster tried to reclaim ownership.
But the court ruled that their initial desperate transfer back in 1938 negated that renewal option.
Exactly. The court ruled they had transferred the renewal rights to DC all the way back in 1938. Siegel and Schuster appealed. The decision was upheld, and once again, DC reacted by firing Siegel immediately after the lawsuit was filed. This pattern of dismissal and relitigation, it just underscores the profound emotional and financial toll that this fight must have taken on them.
It really took outside pressure to force any kind of humane resolution.
It did. By 1975, a major public campaign was launched demanding better compensation and treatment for the creators. And this finally moved Warner Bros. To action. They agreed to grant Siegel and Schuster a yearly stipend, full medical benefits, and the mandatory on-screen credit.
That familiar phrase, Superman, created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster.
That one. And it had to be on all productions, in exchange for a final pact that they would never contest ownership again. They finally achieved recognition, even if it wasn't full ownership.
But the legal instability didn't end there. Their heirs continued the fight after the creators passed away, leveraging new laws.
The heirs attempted to regain rights using the termination provision of the Copyright Act of 1976. This provision was designed to allow creators, or their heirs, after a set period of time, to reclaim rights to works that were transferred under the older, often exploitative laws. The battle dragged on for years.
And while a 2008 ruling briefly favored Siegel's heirs, it was ultimately overturned.
It was overturned on appeal, yes. The court argued that a 2001 letter of agreement with DC, which involved multi-million-dollar payments and ongoing stipends, was legally binding and it superseded the termination provision. DC retained ownership, ensuring the character remains largely under their corporate control, but the creator's heirs did secure substantial ongoing financial recognition.
This entire saga of creation and loss highlights a huge upcoming legal deadline, which is the public domain horizon.
This is a date every creator and every studio has marked on their calendar, January 1st, 2034. On that day, the copyright for Superman's first appearance in Action Comics #1 is due to enter the U.S. public domain.
But we have to be very specific about what that actually means.
Yes, the distinction between copyright and trademark is absolutely critical here.
So what's the difference?
Copyright protects the specific expression of the character in the work, the story, the look, the powers, as they existed in 1938, and copyrights expire. However, DC Comics retains trademarks on the name Superman, his modern image, and the iconic S logo.
And trademarks don't expire.
They don't. As long as the owner continually uses them to identify their goods, they protect branding and identification.
So after 2034, you could create stories about a leaping, bulletproof vigilante from a destroyed planet who fights corruption. But you couldn't necessarily call him Superman or give him sustained flight or use kryptonite or use the exact modern logo without facing some serious trademark issues.
That is the consensus, yes. Creators will be limited to that original 1938 framework, the leaping social activist version. It creates a fascinating legal and creative challenge for future storytelling, forcing new works to rely purely on the foundational concepts established in that very first appearance.
But before Superman's dominance was completely cemented, DC had to eliminate the competition. They secured their position through a massive legal battle against an imitator.
You are referring to the Captain Marvel precedent with Fawcett Comics. Superman's success immediately led to imitations, and Captain Marvel, first published in 1939, was by far the most successful.
He was very similar.
Very. He had Herculean strength, flight, a cape, a secret identity, and he even worked as a journalist. DC Comics sued Fawcett for copyright infringement.
The trial was a long, complex affair that almost backfired on DC because of a technicality, wasn't it, about copyright notices?
It was a marathon that began in 1948. Initially, the judge ruled in DC's favor regarding the infringement, but critically also found that the copyright notices placed on the Superman newspaper strips were technically invalid under the hyper-specific requirements of the 1909 Copyright Act.
And because the newspaper strips adapted the comic book stories?
The judge initially argued that DC had effectively forfeited the copyright to the original Action Comics stories.
A major setback. That could have made Superman public domain decades and decades early.
Yes, but DC appealed. The appellate court overturned that specific finding, ruling that unintentional mistakes didn't invalidate the copyrights, especially since Fawcett knew DC never intended to abandon them. This secured DC's ownership, and the case was sent back to determine damages. At that point, Fawcett Comics wisely settled out of court.
And that settlement secured DC's dominance in the superhero market for good.
Fawcett paid DC Comics $400,000 and agreed to cease publishing Captain Marvel stories entirely, ending the character's run in 1953. This victory solidified DC's position and eventually led to DC acquiring the Captain Marvel character in 1991 and renaming him Shazam to avoid conflict with Marvel Comics' own character of the same name.
The legal history is certainly complex, but the outcome of all that complexity is this enduring cultural legacy. Superman is arguably the first and most recognizable superhero archetype.
He established all the core genre conventions: the code name, the costume, the extraordinary abilities, the altruistic mission. And while characters like Zorro and the Phantom came before him, Superman's success in 1938 is what launched the golden age of comic books. And furthermore, his sustained popularity through the decline of that era then fueled the Silver Age revival in the late 1950s, which set the stage for virtually all modern superhero fiction.
And his influence spread far beyond American borders, didn't it?
Globally, yes. His impact was particularly notable in Japan after World War II. The 1940s animated shorts and the popular 1950s Adventures of Superman TV show, they achieved huge popularity there, and they inspired Japan's own prolific superhero genre.
A lineage that starts with films like
Supergiant in 1957, and then later iconic figures like Astro Boy and Ultraman.
Beyond genre, Superman is treated as a serious artistic subject.
He transcended commercial art. Since the pop art period in the 1960s, Superman has been continuously appropriated and reinterpreted by visual artists, including celebrated figures like Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein, which reflects his status as a truly universal symbol.
Let's look now at some of the deeper literary and sociological readings of the character. The most prominent interpretation, particularly relevant when you consider the background of his creators, is Superman as the quintessential immigrant allegory.
This reading is powerful and very compelling. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were both Jewish Americans, and the story of Kal-El sent in a rocket by desperate parents just before their world is destroyed, then adopted by a foreign culture. It strongly parallels the historical experiences of refugees and immigrants, and there are profound parallels to the story of Moses.
How does the dual identity function within that allegory of immigration?
Well, literary analysis suggests that the dual identity allows immigrants to identify with both of their cultures. Clark Kent represents assimilation, the mild-mannered, passive persona trying desperately to fit in with the dominant American culture.
And Superman is the other side of that coin.
Superman, conversely, embodies empowerment. It's the conscious use of one's unique cultural heritage and strength, in this case, Kryptonian power, for the greater good of the adopted society. The story really challenged that early 20th century notion that Anglo-Saxon ancestry was the exclusive source of American might.
And his archenemy, Lex Luthor, often explicitly highlights the xenophobic angle in more modern stories.
Luthor frequently exploits xenophobia against Superman in modern interpretations. He explicitly underscores this theme of the alien threat. It makes the allegory impossible to ignore. Writers have noted how the character particularly resonates with the experiences of anyone who feels marginalized or who has to hide their true nature to survive in their adopted home.
Beyond the immigrant narrative, his earliest stories were deeply tied to the context of the Great Depression.
That's a crucial early element. The early Superman acted as a direct social activist, reflecting Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal idealism. He fought crooked businessmen and politicians, sometimes physically demolishing rundown tenements just to force government action, often to the consternation of the authorities.
And this extended into the radio programs.
Yes, which famously tackled issues like anti-Semitism and veteran discrimination, including taking on a version of the Ku Klux Klan in 1946.
And finally, the religious parallels. We mentioned the Moses comparison, but the character has also been viewed through a Christian lens, particularly in film adaptations.
The popular Judaic parallels connect Kal-El's escape in a rocket or basket and his adoption by a foreign culture directly to the Moses story. And the name Kal-El is circumstantially believed to resemble the Hebrew phrase Kuil-Nel, which translates to voice of God.
And this was noticed at the time.
Oh yes, the Nazis certainly saw him as a Jewish creation. The Schutzstaffel newspaper Das Schwarze Kors denounced both Superman and Jerry Siegel in 1940. While Siegel and Schuster never consciously confirmed these influences, later media adaptations consciously incorporated Christian messianic themes.
The 1978 movie, for instance.
The 1978 Christopher Reeve film, written by Tom Mankiewicz, depicts baby Kal-El's arrival ship resembling the Star of Bethlehem. And this theme was revisited and made even more explicit in the 2013 film Man of Steel, where Jor-El explicitly assigned Superman a mission to guide humanity down a wiser, less corrupt path, redeeming the mistakes of his own race.
This has been a remarkable analysis, tracing the character from a simple, evil, bald psychic through his development as a Depression-era social activist, his transition to the mythological Big Blue Boy Scout under Weisinger, and then his constant reinvention across decades of reboots.
The history really reveals a paradox. He is constantly changing. His powers shrink and grow. His origin is revised. He dies and comes back. But his core remains absolutely stable. As we discussed, the enduring power comes from that original creative spark. The simple contrast of the timid, bespectacled Clark Kent hiding the power of a god.
A mechanism born from wish fulfillment.
Exactly. From the wish fulfillment of two awkward, imaginative young men. And it's that universal contrast that maintains his appeal regardless of how the lore constantly shifts around him.
That brings us back to that horizon we noted earlier, January 1st, 2034, when the copyright to the original Action Comics #1 character enters the public domain.
It raises a really important question for the future of creativity. Consider the limitations of that original 1938 version of Superman. He cannot fly, he has to leap everywhere, he is vulnerable to certain conventional weaponry, and his primary focus is aggressive social justice, not fighting alien tyrants or colorful supervillains.
So the question is,
how might new artists and writers utilize only those foundational, leaping, bulletproof vigilante concepts to tell entirely new, grounded stories about the original iteration of the Man of Tomorrow? What kind of gritty Depression-era tales might emerge when only the most rudimentary version of the hero is available? It's something for you to mull over and explore yourself.
an intriguing thought indeed. We've covered the genesis, the mythology, and the profound cost of that creation.
A truly comprehensive study of the enduring icon.
Thanks for listening.